I am Dr. Maren Cole. I am 31 years old. I hold the title of Chief of Pediatric Cardiac Surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. I have cracked open a child's chest at 3 in the morning, held a heart the size of a walnut in my gloved hands, and sewn it back together while the parents prayed in the hallway. But last Thanksgiving, at my mother's kitchen table in Richmond, Virginia, my stepfather Derek looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a glorified nurse who couldn't even keep a husband. He said it while chewing my mother's sweet potato casserole with his mouth open. He said it in front of my 12-year-old niece, and my mother just stared at her plate and said nothing. Derek Hale, 56 years old, retired pharmaceutical sales rep. He tells everyone he was a regional vice president. He was not. He was a territory manager covering a 3-county stretch in Southern Virginia, pushing cholesterol medication to family clinics. He retired early, not because he made enough money, but because the company restructured and his position was eliminated. He landed on my mother like a vulture lands on a carcass, 3 months after my father's funeral. When the life insurance check had just cleared and her grief made her blind, he moved into my parents' house, the house my father built with his own hands. The house that was paid off 17 years ago. And he started redecorating. He threw out my father's recliner. He painted over the height marks on the kitchen doorframe where Dad used to measure me and my sister every birthday. He replaced the family photos in the hallway with framed motivational posters. One of them said, "Winners don't complain." It was hanging directly above the spot where my father's Purple Heart used to be displayed. If you have ever watched someone erase the memory of a person you loved while the person who should be protecting that memory just stood there and let it happen, hit that subscribe button right now. Type "I see you" in the comments so I know I'm not alone. The week before Christmas, I drove down from Baltimore. It was a 4-hour drive in light traffic. But the 95 corridor was a parking lot. So, it took me 6. I pulled into the driveway at 9 in the evening. The house looked wrong. The gutters were sagging. The porch light was out. My father would have fixed both of those things before breakfast. I walked through the front door and the smell hit me. Stale cigar smoke and some kind of cheap pine air freshener trying to cover it up. The combination was nauseating. The living room had been rearranged again. Derek's massive leather recliner, the one he bought to replace my father's, now sat in the center of the room like a throne, angled to face the 70-inch television he had purchased on my mother's visa. My mother came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked thinner than the last time I saw her. The hollows under her cheekbones were deeper. Her cardigan hung off her shoulders like it belonged to someone else. She hugged me and I could feel her ribs. "Baby," she whispered, "I'm so glad you're here." "Where's Derek?" I asked. She flinched at the name, a tiny involuntary contraction around her eyes that she immediately covered with a smile. "He's in the den. He had a long day. He's been managing the renovation project." "What renovation project?" "The basement. He's converting it into a home gym. Custom equipment, rubber flooring, the works. He says it will increase the property value." "Mom, who's paying for that?" She didn't answer. She just smoothed the dish towel between her hands, over and over, like she was trying to iron out a wrinkle that would never flatten. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "I made pot roast." He likes pot roast on Fridays. Derek appeared 20 minutes later. He walked into the dining room like a man walking onto a stage. He was wearing a polo shirt tucked into pressed khakis, a Rolex on his wrist that I was 90% sure was counterfeit, and the self-satisfied expression of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved what he had. "Well, well," he said, spreading his arms wide. "The prodigy returns." He pulled out his chair at the head of the table. My father's chair. He sat down without waiting for anyone else. "Pour me some of that cab, would you, Diane?" My mother jumped up and grabbed the wine bottle. I watched her hands tremble as she poured. The wine sloshed slightly over the rim. Derek looked at the spill, then looked at her, then looked at me, as if to say, "You see what I deal with?" "So, Maren," he said, cutting into the pot roast before my mother had even sat down. "Still playing doctor up in Baltimore?" "I'm a surgeon, Derek." Right. He waved his fork dismissively. "You know, my buddy Phil's daughter just made partner at a law firm in D.C. 28 years old. Drives a Mercedes. Bought a condo in Georgetown. Now, that's a career. He pointed the fork at me. You're what, 30? 31. 31. He shook his head. And still single. No ring, no kids. Just cutting people open all day. He took a long sip of wine. What kind of life is that? The kind where I save children's lives, I said. My voice was calm, but I could feel the heat rising in my chest. He laughed. It was a barking, dismissive sound. Save lives. You know what saves lives, Maren? Prevention. That's what I did for 20 years. I kept people from getting sick in the first place. You just patch them up after the damage is done. You're a mechanic. A glorified mechanic in a white coat. My mother was staring at her plate. Her fork was motionless. My niece Lily, my sister's daughter who was staying for the holidays, was looking between us with wide, frightened eyes. Then my phone buzzed. It was sitting face down on the table. I reached for it instinctively. It was the hospital. A text from Dr. Anand, my fellow. I glanced at the screen. 6-year-old. Tetralogy of Fallot. Deteriorating. May need emergency repair. Consulting with Dr. Webb but wanted you aware. I started to type a response. Derek's hand slammed down on the table. The silverware jumped. The wine glasses trembled. My niece gasped. No phones at my table, he said, his voice dropping to that low, threatening register he used when he wanted to remind everyone who was in charge. I am talking to you. That is my hospital, I said. A child is sick. A child is always sick, he sneered. That's how they keep you on the hook. You're not important enough to be on call on a Friday night, Maren. You're not the head of anything. You're just a resident or whatever they call it. I'm the chief of pediatric cardiac surgery, I said. He stared at me for a moment. Then he laughed again. Louder this time. Leaning back in his chair. Chief. He said the word like it was a joke. Chief of what? Cutting open babies? That's not a real title. That's a participation trophy. He leaned forward, his eyes hard. Let me tell you something, sweetheart. I managed a territory that generated $12 million in annual revenue. 12 million. I had 47 reps reporting to me. I sat in boardrooms with the CEO. That is leadership. What you do is manual labor with a fancy degree. I looked at him. I looked at this man who sold pills to small-town doctors and thought it made him a titan of industry. I looked at the fake Rolex. I looked at the wine he was drinking from a bottle that my mother paid for. I looked at the chair he was sitting in, my father's chair, in my father's house. And I thought about the 6-year-old in Baltimore whose heart was failing. I put my phone in my pocket. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I just said, "You're right, Derek. I should be more present." He looked surprised, then suspicious, then satisfied. He went back to his pot roast, sawing at it with the serrated knife, oblivious and triumphant. My mother exhaled. Lily stared at me with something that looked like disappointment. I excused myself after dinner. I went upstairs to my old bedroom. Derek had turned it into a storage room for his golf clubs and boxes of old sales awards. Regional Excellence. Q3 2011. I had to move a set of tailor-made irons off the bed just to sit down. I pulled out my phone and called Dr. Anand back. The child was stable for now, but would likely need surgery within 48 hours. I told him to prep the OR and keep me updated. Then I started going through the mail my mother had left on the dresser. It was a habit from the last few visits. Bills. Credit card statements. A second mortgage notice. I froze. A second mortgage. On a house that had been fully paid off for 17 years. I opened the envelope. Derek had taken out a home equity line of credit for $120,000 against my mother's house. The house was in her name. He had convinced her to sign. The money had been drawn down to $14,000 remaining. I pulled up the bank statements I had photographed on my last visit and compared. In the last 8 months, Derek had spent over $100,000. The basement gym. A fishing boat docked at a marina in the Outer Banks. Monthly payments on a storage unit in Chesterfield that I suspected held more toys he didn't need. Membership at a country club. Cigars. Cases of wine delivered monthly. All of it funded by my mother's home equity, her teacher's pension, and the life insurance money my father had left to protect her. I sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by Derek's golf clubs, and I felt something click into place behind my sternum. It wasn't anger. Anger is hot and loud. This was cold. This was the same feeling I get when I open a child's chest and see the defect, and the room goes quiet, and the only thing that exists is the problem and the solution. I knew what I had to do, but I needed to be patient. Derek was planning a New Year's Eve party. He had been talking about it for weeks. He had invited the neighbors, some old colleagues, and most importantly, a man named Gerald Webb, who sat on the board of the local country club. Derek had been lobbying Gerald for months to sponsor his full membership. This party was Derek's audition. He wanted to prove he was a man of substance, a man with a beautiful home and a gracious wife, and the kind of life that warranted a mahogany locker at the club. He needed everything to be perfect. And he needed help. The next morning, Derek was waiting for me in the kitchen at 7. He was wearing a bathrobe and holding a clipboard. He had made a list. "Maren," he said, not looking up. "The party is in 6 days. Your mother can't handle this alone. She burns everything and she has no sense of presentation. So you're going to help." I poured myself coffee. My mother was already at the stove, scrambling eggs. She looked exhausted. "What do you need?" I said. Derek smiled. It was the smile of a man who thought he had just recruited free labor. "I need the house spotless. I need the menu planned and executed. I need you to handle the bar setup. And on the night of the party, I need you to manage the kitchen. You will not be a guest. You will be working." He tapped the clipboard. "You'll wear something presentable. Black pants, white blouse, hair pulled back. No scrubs, no sneakers, no hospital talk. These are sophisticated people, Maren. They don't want to hear about sick children while they're eating shrimp cocktail." I gripped my coffee mug. My mother was watching me, her eyes pleading. "Please, baby," she mouthed silently. "Just this once." I looked at Derek. I looked at his clipboard and his bathrobe and his counterfeit Rolex. He wanted me invisible. He wanted me serving canapes to people he was trying to impress, while he played the role of the successful patriarch. He wanted a servant. Fine, I'd give him a server, but what I served wouldn't be what he expected. "I'll handle everything," I said. My voice was pleasant and cooperative and completely devoid of the fury burning behind my ribs. "Good," he said, surprised by my compliance. "That's the first smart thing you've said since you got here." He walked out of the kitchen, already barking at my mother about the state of the guest bathroom. I pulled out my phone and texted my colleague and mentor, Dr. Patricia Okafor, the chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins, my boss and the most formidable woman I had ever met. "I need a favor." "A big one. Name it," she replied. The next 6 days were a blur of preparation and quiet reconnaissance. I cleaned the house from top to bottom. I polished silver that hadn't been touched since my father's funeral. I planned a menu that was deliberately impressive. Seared scallops, braised short ribs, a chocolate soufflé. I wanted the food to be extraordinary because I wanted the contrast to be devastating. While I cleaned, I gathered evidence. I photographed every financial document I could find. The home equity statements, the credit card bills, the marina receipts, the country club invoices. I found the storage unit key in his desk drawer and drove out to Chesterfield. Inside the unit were 2 jet skis, a pool table still in its shipping crate, and a 60-inch flat-screen television still in the box, all purchased on my mother's credit. I compiled everything into a file. I backed it up to the cloud. I sent copies to my sister Rachel in Charlottesville, who was an attorney specializing in elder financial abuse. Rachel had been waiting for this. She had been begging Mom to leave for 2 years, but Mom always defended Derek, always made excuses. Rachel drafted a civil protection order and a demand for full financial restitution. She had it notarized and ready. All it needed was a signature and a moment. On December 30th, the day before the party, my phone rang. It was Dr. Anand. The 6-year-old, a girl named Sophia, was crashing. The tetralogy repair couldn't wait. I drove back to Baltimore at 90 miles an hour. I scrubbed in at midnight. The surgery took 5 hours. Sophia's heart was a disaster. The pulmonary stenosis worse than the imaging suggested. The ventricular septal defect wider than we anticipated. But I rebuilt her outflow tract. I patched the septum. I watched the monitors as her oxygen saturation climbed from the 60s to the high 90s. At 5 in the morning, I stood in the hallway and told Sophia's parents that their daughter was going to live. Her mother collapsed into her father's arms. He looked at me with an expression I will carry to my grave. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, doctor." I drove back to Richmond that afternoon. running on 4 hours of sleep and hospital coffee. I had saved a child's life 12 hours before. And now, I was going home to be told I was a disappointment by a man who had never done anything harder than hit his quarterly sales target. The contrast would have been funny if it weren't so enraging. New Year's Eve. The house was transformed. I had strung lights along the front porch. The dining table was set with my mother's good china, the set she received as a wedding gift from my grandmother. The short ribs were braising in the oven. The scallops were prepped and waiting. The bar was stocked with top-shelf liquor that Derek had purchased on. You guessed it, my mother's credit card. Guests began arriving at 7. The neighbors, Jim and Patty Wheeler. 2 of Derek's former colleagues, men named Bryson and Walsh, both of whom looked like they had peaked in 2005. And the guest of honor, Gerald Webb, a tall silver-haired man in a cashmere blazer who carried himself with the quiet confidence of old money. His wife, Judith, came with him, wearing pearls and a polite smile. Derek was in full performance mode. He wore a navy blazer with gold buttons, pressed slacks, and a tie that he probably thought made him look like a senator. He shook hands too firmly, laughed too loudly, and steered every conversation back to himself. Gerald, you would not believe the renovation I'm doing in the basement. Full gym, commercial-grade equipment. I used to bench 315 back in my day. Gerald nodded politely, sipping his scotch. I was in the kitchen, plating scallops. I was wearing the black pants and white blouse Derek had demanded. My hair was pulled back. I looked exactly like what he wanted me to look like. The help. I carried plates to the table. I refilled wine glasses. I cleared courses. Derek didn't introduce me. Not once. When Gerald asked who I was, Derek said, "Oh, that's Diane's daughter. She's between things right now, helping out around the house." Between things. I had performed open-heart surgery on a child 36 hours ago. And this man was telling people I was between things. I didn't react. I placed the short ribs on the table and returned to the kitchen. I checked my phone. 2 texts. One from Rachel. I walked back into the dining room and began clearing the salad plates. Derek was mid-story. A long, rambling account of the time he supposedly convinced a hospital network to switch their entire formulary based on his presentation alone. I closed a $50 million deal in that boardroom, he said, gesturing with his wine glass. $50 million. The CEO shook my hand and said, "Derek, you are the reason this company exists." Gerald raised an eyebrow. He looked unimpressed, but too polite to say so. That's when Derek turned the spotlight on me. The moment I had been waiting for. My stepdaughter here is a perfect example of what happens when you have book smarts but no real-world sense. 31 years old. No husband. No house. Still working some hospital job. He looked at me, standing by the sideboard with a stack of dirty plates in my hands. "Maren, tell Gerald what you do." I looked at him. Everyone was looking at me. "I'm a doctor," I said quietly. "She's a doctor," Derek repeated, making air quotes with his fingers. "She works with kids. Pediatrician or something. Basically a babysitter with a stethoscope." He laughed at his own joke. No one else did. Gerald was watching me with a curious expression. Judith set down her fork. I set the plates on the sideboard. I did not respond. I walked back into the kitchen. Through the swinging door, I could hear Derek continuing. "The point is, Gerald, real success isn't about degrees. It's about influence. It's about being the man people call when they need results." The doorbell rang. Derek frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone else. "I'll get it," I said, already moving toward the front door. I opened it. Standing on the porch, silhouetted by the glow of the Christmas lights I had strung 2 days ago, was Dr. Patricia Okafor. She was 6 feet tall in heels, wearing a charcoal dress that probably cost more than Derek's entire wardrobe. Behind her stood Dr. James Chen, the chair of cardiothoracic surgery at Johns Hopkins, a man whose face had been on the cover of Time magazine. And beside him, holding a bottle of Dom Perignon, was Dr. Michael Adebayo, who had flown in from the Cleveland Clinic, where he served as the chief medical officer. Behind them, parked on the street, was a black Lincoln Town car with Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions plates. "Maren, Doctor," Okafor said, pulling me into a hug. "Happy New Year." "How's our girl Sophia doing?" "She's stable," I said. Extubated. This morning, SATs are holding at 97. Beautiful work, Dr. Chen said, shaking my hand. That VSD closure was textbook. I reviewed the operative notes on the flight up. Dr. Adebayo smiled warmly. When Patricia told me you needed moral support for a family dinner, I cleared my calendar. Nobody puts our Maren in the corner. I laughed. The first real laugh in a week. Thank you all for coming. I cannot tell you what this means. I led them inside. The sound of their voices, confident, cultured, authoritative, preceded them into the dining room like a wave. Derek looked up from his wine glass. His mouth was open, mid-sentence, frozen in an expression of confusion. His eyes darted from Dr. Okafor to Dr. Chen to Dr. Adebayo. He didn't recognize them, but Gerald Webb did. Gerald set down his scotch glass and slowly rose from his chair. "Jim," he said, his face breaking into genuine surprise. "Jim Chen. Is that you?" "James," Gerald corrected gently, shaking his hand. "Gerald, good to see you. It's been, 3 years since the Kennedy Center Gala?" Gerald turned to me, then back to Dr. Chen, then back to me again. "You know Dr. Cole?" Gerald asked. "Know her?" Dr. Chen said. "Dr. Cole is one of the finest cardiac surgeons in the country. She just performed a landmark repair on a pediatric tetralogy case that my department is going to publish in the Journal of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgery. She is the youngest chief of pediatric cardiac surgery in Johns Hopkins history." The room went silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone being rude. The ringing, absolute silence of a reality being rewritten in real time. Derek's face went white. Then gray. Then a shade of green I had only ever seen in patients about to vomit. "Chief," Derek whispered. Dr. Okafor stepped forward. She towered over Derek in her heels. She extended her hand with the serene confidence of a woman who had spent 30 years commanding operating rooms. "You must be Derek," she said. Her voice was warm, but her eyes were surgical. "I'm Dr. Patricia Okafor, Chief of Surgery at Johns Hopkins. Maren is my protégée. She's also the reason a 6-year-old girl in our ICU is going to see her 7th birthday. I flew down tonight because Maren mentioned she was spending New Year's with family, and I wanted to personally deliver some news." She turned to me. "Maren, the board approved it this morning. You've been nominated for the Michael E. DeBakey Award for Excellence in Research or Clinical Surgery. You're the youngest nominee in the award's history." I stared at her. I hadn't known. She had kept it a surprise. Dr. Adebayo raised the bottle of Dom Perignon, hence the champagne. Gerald Webb was beaming. He looked at Derek. "Derek," he said, "you didn't tell me your stepdaughter was Dr. Maren Cole. My wife and I donated to the Hopkins Children's Cardiac Fund last year, specifically because of her program." Derek opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked like a fish pulled from the water, gasping at an atmosphere he was never built to breathe. I stepped forward. I stood in front of Derek in my black pants and white blouse, the servant's uniform he had chosen for me. But the costume didn't matter anymore. The room knew who I was. "Derek," I said softly. My voice was steady and cold. "You told these people I was between things. You told them I was a babysitter with a stethoscope. You made me serve dinner in my father's house while you sat in his chair and spent my mother's money." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the folded papers I had been carrying all night. The home equity statement, the credit card bills, the storage unit inventory, the marina receipts. I placed them on the table, next to the good china. $106,000, I said. "That's how much you've drained from my mother in 18 months. A second mortgage on a paid-off house, jet skis in a storage unit, a boat she's never seen, monthly dues at a country club you haven't been accepted to yet." Derek lunged for the papers. "Don't," I said. The word came out with such authority that he stopped mid-reach. It was the same voice I used when a resident was about to make a fatal mistake in my OR. "Those are copies," I continued. "My sister Rachel, who is an attorney specializing in elder financial abuse, has the originals. Along with a civil protection order and a demand for full restitution, you have 72 hours to vacate this house." Gerald Webb slowly sat back down. He picked up his scotch, took a long sip, and looked at Derek with an expression that ended any chance of a country club membership. Derek's shoulders caved. The blazer with the gold buttons suddenly looked ridiculous, a costume on a man who had been playing a role he never earned. He turned to my mother. "Diane," he said. His voice cracked. Diane, tell them. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. I handle the finances because you asked me to. You wanted me to take care of things. My mother had been standing in the doorway to the kitchen, clutching a dish towel. She had watched the whole thing. She looked at Derek. She looked at the papers on the table. She looked at the hollow space on the hallway wall where my father's purple heart used to hang. Then she looked at me. She straightened her back. She let go of the dish towel. It fell to the floor in a soft heap. I didn't ask you to take a second mortgage on my husband's house, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. I didn't ask you to throw away his recliner. I didn't ask you to take down his purple heart. And I never, ever asked you to treat my daughter like she was nothing. She took a step toward him. You told me I couldn't survive alone. You told me no one else would want me. You told me I needed a strong man. She took another step. But my daughter just saved a child's life. My granddaughter is watching me right now. And I would rather eat dinner alone every night for the rest of my life than spend one more meal sitting across from you. She untied her apron. She folded it once, a lifetime habit. Then she dropped it on the floor next to the dish towel. Goodbye, Derek. The room was motionless. Lily, my 12-year-old niece, was standing in the hallway. She had seen everything. She walked up to her grandmother and took her hand. You're not alone, Grandma, she said. You have us. My mother squeezed her hand and smiled. Dr. Okafor cleared her throat gently. She looked at Gerald and Judith. I believe there's a bottle of Dom Perignon that needs opening. Shall we toast the new year somewhere more appropriate? Gerald stood. I know a place, he said. There's a restaurant on Carey Street that owes me a favor. He offered his arm to my mother with a courtly bow. Diane, would you join us? My mother looked at him, startled. She looked at me. I nodded. She took Gerald's arm, and for the first time in 2 years, she walked out of that house without looking over her shoulder. We left Derek standing alone in the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner he had orchestrated to showcase his success. The short ribs were getting cold. The candles were guttering. His wine glass was empty. Through the window, I could see the Christmas lights reflecting off the parked cars, as my mother climbed into the back of the Lincoln Town car, laughing at something Dr. Adebayo said. She looked like a woman who had just remembered she was allowed to breathe. I paused at the front door. I looked back at Derek one last time. He was sitting in my father's chair, staring at the papers on the table. He looked small. He looked exactly like what he was. A man whose entire identity was built on the labor and love and money of the people he had convinced to carry him. Clean up the kitchen, Derek, I said. I hate coming back to a mess. I closed the door behind me. The night air was cold and clean, and it tasted like the first day of the rest of my mother's life. Within a week, Rachel had filed the protection order. Derek was served on January 3rd. He contested nothing. He had no legal ground and no money of his own to fight with. He was out of the house by January 10th. The last I heard, he was living in a furnished apartment in Henrico, selling his jet skis on Facebook Marketplace to cover the rent. The country club membership never materialized. Gerald Webb made sure of that with a single phone call. My mother moved slowly at first, like a plant turning toward sunlight after years in a dark room. She joined a book club. She started walking the neighborhood every morning. She repainted the living room the sage green color she had always wanted. She put my father's purple heart back on the wall and bought a new recliner that she picked out herself, a soft blue one that nobody else was allowed to sit in. In March, she drove up to Baltimore to visit me at the hospital. I gave her a tour of the pediatric cardiac unit. She met Sophia, the 6-year-old whose heart I had repaired on New Year's Eve. Sophia was running down the hallway in her hospital gown, chasing a balloon, laughing so hard the nurses had to tell her to slow down. My mother watched that little girl run, and she started to cry. She turned to me. Your father would be so proud of you, she said. I know, Mom. I hugged her. She smelled like her garden, like the expensive sunscreen she had finally started buying for herself, and like a woman who was no longer afraid. She pulled back and looked at me with clear, steady eyes. You know what Derek was wrong about? She said. Everything, I said. She shook her head. He said I couldn't survive alone. But I'm not alone, Maren. I never was. I just forgot. That night, I drove back to Baltimore. The highway was empty. The city skyline glowed against the dark water of the harbor. I thought about my father, a quiet man who never raised his voice but whose strength held our family together like the beams of the house he built. I thought about Derek, A loud man whose strength was an illusion that crumbled the moment someone turned on the lights. And I thought about what I had learned. Power is not the loudest voice in the room. Power is the surgeon's hands at 3 in the morning. Power is the mother who finally drops the apron. Power is the 12-year-old who takes her grandmother's hand and says, "You're not alone." If my story gave you the courage to stand a little taller today, subscribe to Favored Revenge. We share stories like this every day. And tell me in the comments, what is your silver star moment? I want to hear how you won your war. Because silence is not weakness. Silence is just reloading.